this session is going to cover kind of a suite of connected issues. We've been talking a lot about academic research over the last few days, but obviously there are a lot of other data sources out there that are not just coming from academics. And part of that conversation is about open data, access to lots of different types of data. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about also a little bit about how communities are contributing their own data sets and how they're using them. And we're also going to connect this to your reporting with a conversation about engagement reporting, community engaged reporting that ProPublica is doing. So to tell us more about that, we're first going to hear from Shannon Dosmagen, who is a fellow with the Shuttleworth Foundation. And as you'll see from her bio link, she's definitely like an innovator and accelerator in a lot of different ways, especially when it comes to open data. And then we will hear from Catherine Alias, who is the manager, I want to make sure I get this right, manager of community infrastructure and resilience at the Center for Neighborhood Technology based in Chicago. And then finally, we'll hear from Maya Miller, who is an engagement reporter at ProPublica. So with that, Shannon, why don't you get us started?
Great. All right. Nice to meet all of you. I was having a moment where I'm like, oh, I gotta connect with journalists, and I am not a journalist. I'm a environmental practitioner, but maybe just to actually try to make the connection a bit. So I have been doing this kind of work of connecting open technology and community-based science with supporting communities that have issues with environmental and climate issues for going on 20 years now. And I kind of back in the heyday where some of you might remember the concept of civic media, which I really just don't hear around all that much anymore. The organization I was with previously, Public Lab, received our earliest funding from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation through the Knight News Challenge that basically kicked us off. So they very much saw us as, part of the civic media landscape of people who were, going out and thinking differently about data and information and how to get people involved in it. So it's really nice to be speaking with you all. And I want to take you a bit on a trajectory of how I've been thinking about this space through the various groups and communities that I've been involved with. So I'm going to share some slides. And you're welcome to, I don't know if this is against the rules, Sunshine, but you're welcome to interject, ask questions, drop things in the chat, and we can go from there. All right. Okay, can everybody see that? All right. Cool. Okay, so I go back in the work that I've been doing. I'm hello to the folks that are in Louisiana. I'm also based in New Orleans. And I got some of my earliest experiences in specifically thinking about open data and then other open technologies when I was working with a small organization called the Louisiana Bucket Brigade years and years ago. And from that, I moved into co-founding a group called Public Lab in 2010 during the BP oil disaster. And we specifically worked on applying open technology to issues of environmental injustice. A lot of my work was in Louisiana, but we also supported communities worldwide. I've started a community called the Gathering for Open Science Hardware. So it's people from 40 different countries that are thinking about accessible, low-cost scientific equipment, including tools for environmental monitoring and climate monitoring. And then the current work that I'm focused on is with open environmental data projects. So it's very much about trying to solve some of the infrastructural complexities of how data does or does not move from communities to government, to scientists, to journalists. And then also, what do we do with all the vast amounts of open data sets that we actually have? How do we ensure that they're accessible and usable for folks like yourself, for community researchers, for social scientists? So I want to kind of take you on a path of some of the key things that have learned over the years that I'm sure is probably going to be very familiar to most of you, but I hope to give you a a little bit of a different perspective, one from a practice-based point of view. So again, I was working long ago with the Louisiana Bucket Brigade, and the back in the day, the Bucket Brigade now focuses more on organizing and campaigning. But what they're known for, and their namesake is this replica of an EPA SUMA canister. So it's a 5-gallon bucket that allows people to go out and do very quick grab samples of air quality. And the reason for that, if you see one of the small pictures, is that in the middle of the night, we call this the midnight sun in Louisiana, companies will shoot up these flares, and it's at a time when EPA or LDEQ is not going to come out and do additional monitoring. So this was a quick way for communities to be able to take their own air samples, to potentially say, this is what is in the air that I'm breathing. And I think I always come back to this moment because it was so important for me and thinking about the goal of why we were doing this air sampling. It wasn't to say like, okay, we have benzene, we have, hydrogen sulfide, we have heightened levels of X, Y, and Z. It was to socially situate that there was an environmental injustice being done. And in doing that, one of the primary goals and the kind of earliest teachings that I learned from working with this group was it was more important to be able to tell the story through how we collected the data than to be able to get as close as possible to the fence line and to the facility. So data that came from the kindergarten playground or data that came from the steps of the local church told a story. It told a human story of what people were breathing, because these are spaces that people come to gather in. And so I think this was really a concept that has grounded me throughout the next 15 years of my career. Moving into public lab, so I don't know, maybe some of you will remember the 2010 BP disaster. I know that's getting to be a bit long ago, but I started working with a group to develop kind of like early predecessor to drones. So basically big helium balloons and kites that we would attach point and shoot cameras to, and we would send it about 2,000 feet up into the air above the Gulf of Mexico. And we worked with about 250 volunteers, mapping about 100 miles of the coastline from Louisiana to the panhandle of Florida, and then collecting about 200,000 images, which were built into a community atlas that told the community side of the story. So how people were going out, for instance, this image of the Chandler Islands, we did with a guy whose fishing grounds were there, and he wanted to see how his fishing grounds were holding up within a couple days of the BP spill. And from this, we were really intent in the moment on capturing these images, telling a different story. There was a cap over the flight, so you couldn't take planes in certain areas. So it was hard to get actual images from above. So we were, kind of converting that into like sending things up from the ground. And so there was that kind of like radicalism to thinking about data from communities. And then it was also just really important for telling the story of how people were participating in the media. So 2010 was, I think, a moment where we started seeing more and more, resident citizen-based movements. So like the Open Gov movement, Gov 2.0, citizen and community science were booming, civic media. And so it became a story piece for different media outlets. So like Le Monde, New York Times, Bits blog, CNN. And from this, what I gathered and what I've always taken with me to the day is that it's about the process that we're going through as organizers and as practitioners. It's not just the data that we collect. And so if we can always wrap in the stories that give complexity and understanding to place, and I know you as journalists all know this very well, it's going to make things so much easier for the public to identify with and become involved in. So moving on, I led a group called the National Advisory Council for Environmental Policy and Technology back in 2016, right before the Trump administration. We wrote a report for EPA on environmental governance and decision-making and the role of participatory science, citizen community science, environmental monitoring, and how it could help the agency in doing decision-making. And I just wanted to show you this chart because I think this is really important when I get to the next thing that I always think about in terms of like, what's the purpose of gathering data and how we're going to use it, because data can really be used across a spectrum of activities. So to engage communities, to educate, through, even things that journalists are doing, visualizations, et cetera, to indicate that there might be an issue in the area so that further studies from environmental agencies can happen as part of a body of research to help do environmental governance and management, and then less so, but hopefully more so in the future, thinking about policy and regulation, enforcement and compliance. And from this, I think the point to leave is the importance of thinking about good enough data. What's good enough for the purpose that we need the data for? Does the information that you're provided tell a story or add to a story, or weave in some layer of complexity that indicates a local situation? You don't need to read this chart. Please don't read this chart. But I just wanted to point this out. So when I talk about my new work, Open Environmental Data Projects, again, I'm really thinking a lot about infrastructure. And I just wanted to highlight, I was writing a paper recently. We have these analogies in the environmental world about data pipelines. So I think those analogies exist elsewhere as well. But we talk about pipelines and how information moves and how it flows between different things. And in the situation of communities providing information places, I think it's a pretty overused analogy because it's actually quite complicated. And for me, that's why the role of journalism and the role of storytelling and future narrative building is so important in the work that we're doing, because it can really be a middle piece to getting these stories shared more widely. This is just and what it looks like in reality, because it's actually very complex. So I'm going to skip past this quickly because I know we're getting at time. Two of the projects that I'm working on that I just wanted to leave you with and sharing that I've been thinking a lot about, it might be interesting for you to take a look at later. We have a project going called Beyond Compliance, where we're looking at already existing data sets and how different government agencies use them and the complexities in using them, and then how we can take those and make them accessible for the purposes of others, public health researchers, journalists, community researchers, so on and so forth. So we're doing a case right now around environmental health data, and I'm happy to point you to that more in depth later. And then also on a bit of a different note, Open Climate. So this is a project that we've been collaborating on with a number of other folks from organizations such as the Mozilla Foundation, from Wikimedia, from Appropedia, to really try to highlight the climate information that is coming from non-English speaking communities, that's coming from places outside of the United States, that can give us those much more complex and clear vantage points on how local communities are going to be experiencing and are experiencing the effects of climate change. So I will leave you there, hopefully some food for thought, and pass it back to Sunshine.
Thanks, Shannon. We can take a few questions for Shannon before we move on, if anyone has them.
I have a question. Shannon, you said that it's not just about the data you collect in your project, it's about the process. So I'm curious, is there any key part of the community data gathering process that you find the media covering your work often misses, or you wish that they would focus on?
That's a really good question. I've actually never been asked that. I think sometimes the most visible in this process get focused on, and I would really love, in using environmental data, there's lots of different people and places where that happens. From the people collecting it to the people analyzing it, it can be the same person, but I think those stories are so fascinating. So talking about the complexities of process for communities, just to be able to say, I have this environmental issue, or I'm experiencing climate change, in this way in my region. We could tell those stories in such a rich way if we, shared the complexity of process as well.
Davey, go ahead.
Yes, so I dropped my question right when in the chat right when the questions were open. But so I had been wondering about like at what point is it common for in these projects for the scientists as they're collecting data, especially when community sampling, to pitch these ideas to the media, or is it just a small group of scientists who are aware of the power the collaboration can have in sharing these stories? Because I know I get a few calls a couple of years to go on expeditions, but they're not as frequent and they're harder to find. And I think what you said, the nuances with the journey to getting to results is make for good stories as well.
Yeah. So communities that are facing environmental issues are great, I think, at using media as an outreach strategy, because the science that they're doing is a tool to support their organizing efforts typically. So, people who know how to organize know the different tools that are in their toolbox. If it's a scientist that's leading a project, I think it's a much more difficult route for them to take, because at least, I'm not a physical scientist, but in my understanding and experience working with a lot of scientists, it's not something that you learn early on. It's something that you encounter through workshops, or you become part of like the Union of Concerned Scientists science network, or you go through the American Geophysical Union's Thriving Earth Exchange community science program, and you start thinking about how you compare the tools of science with the tools of politics, which is what media is in part. So I think we have a long ways to go still to make stronger connections between formal professional scientists and journalism.
Yeah, I also imagine that that these many scientists don't want to show their work until they have strong conclusions, but a lot of the stories are in the journey too.
Yes, totally. And that's, we're talking about openness, and that is like, it's a key tenet of open, is to, show early and often, to show your failures, to show your mistakes, and also to show your successes. And, so hopefully our worlds of publishing will also start heading in that direction.
Thanks, Shannon. Let's move on to Catherine Alias now. Oh, you're still muted, Catherine.
Let me unmute myself first, because then the things disappear. Okay. Okay. Hey everyone, thanks for bearing with me. I'm Catherine Alias. I use she, her pronouns. I am manager of community infrastructure and resilience, and at Center for Neighborhood Technology. And we are a nonprofit that does a lot of innovative and data analytical work in order to uplift and support communities, as well as municipalities and other agencies to working towards like climate solutions, environmental solutions. And specifically today, I'm going to talk about the urban flooding baseline project. So just a quick grounding. At Center for Neighborhood Technology, we are based in Chicago, which is in Cook County, and we focus a lot on urban flooding because that's the major issue one of the major issues that comes up with climate change here. And part of the reason why that happens is we have a lot of most people know about coastal flooding or river flooding when things happen, things overflow, but there's also a lot of issues because so many of our cities are built much older, the infrastructure was meant for like combined sewer systems. And so when it rains really heavily because of climate change, there's a lot that there's just not enough capacity in the infrastructure to hold that water. And so it ends up flooding communities, and people don't think about that until they live in those spaces. And so they lose a lot of their livelihoods, because in Chicago, especially, a lot of us have basements. And so they lose a lot of the things that they might have there. It damages their house. And when they are working towards building wealth by having a home, those communities, often Black and brown communities in low income areas, are damaged because of that. And they didn't have flood insurance because it's not required when you're not next to a water space. like a water pathway, or two, is just too expensive for them to be able to do. And so they don't get the returns on that, on the insurance when it comes back. And so it really disrupts their lives and it impacts their health. And so what we are trying to do is help bring that light to work and move the definition of flooding to consider urban flooding. And so this is just our definition of urban flooding, but I'm going to continue on to just talk about the project. So we worked on urban flooding for several years now, where first we had these community conversations and developed plans with community members in the south suburbs of Chicago and Cook County. And we're currently in this part of the project where we have 3 different goals. 1 is to define the problem of urban flooding in the Calumet region. 2 is to develop a mapping tool to identify high-risk flooding. And 3 is to have community collection of visual data to help improve indicators. And we want to do this because flooding is such an individual experience. Homeowners, they deal with it, then they feel really ashamed because, like, people are like, oh, that's kind of gross, or they have to deal with all this financial burden. And it's just hard to want to talk about it as a community, but we know it's happening. It happened to my parents all the time, living in the north side of Chicago or northern suburbs. And so, but it's something that it's pretty hush hush when you talk about it, because also when you want to sell your home, you don't want to lose the wealth of by selling your home. And so it has all these implications. So it's really hard to resolve it in a community way, especially when there are so many other priorities that municipalities are focused on and aren't willing to or aren't able to put in, the funding investment to fix the issue. And so we are using this project to help continue the conversation from our phase 1 into our phase 2. And then third, we're going to move into a leadership cohort to help support community members and elected officials and municipal staff to creating a policy agenda. So one thing, one lesson, or one of the first lessons, is continued engagement on the topic across many years to help communities move forward, right? Media and communication can't just be a one and done thing. That doesn't do enough. It has to be the story that's being told with the community and helping to build power. So some context, the red region, so we have this data tool. It's taking mostly quantitative data. And so the red region is where we are focused on. It's on the southern suburbs of Chicago. And then we're taking all this quantitative data that we have from access from the census or from doing FOIAs to for access for insurance, as well as other open source data sets. And then we're doing a community project where we are having community members collect data in the purple region, specifically because we were doing a pilot. This is our first time doing it. And then we also thought about doing one other community, which is in the black outline, and we decided not to continue there because we talked to a couple of our contacts there who are residents, and they're like, this isn't the time to be able to do that here. And so, right, being responsive to community members when collecting data about what makes sense in the political reality of what's happening. So why are we having community members go out and collect data? So in the city of Chicago, a lot of municipalities, they have 311 systems. You can call them up, let them know where flooding is, and this can help them determine where they might put some investments. So there are a couple of issues there. One, typically the people who use 311 systems are the ones who trust the government to do things. And so that's going to be typically white, higher income folks. And so unless there's a lot of effort from community groups and the city itself to have members feel trusting of the system, you're going to have skewed data, and so the investments are going to be off. 2, in other communities, a lot of smaller suburbs, municipalities that have been disinvested in because of a lot of a legacy of disinvestment, redlining, not giving funds to Black and Brown low-income communities. A lot of municipalities don't even have a 311 system. So they don't have an automatic system where they can log where the flooding is happening and using that. And so we wanted to have residents go out and take pictures to kind of show where flooding is happening during the past year after it had rained. And so why are we using community data collectors instead of just hiring anyone who are specifically skilled in it? One is because we want to center the voices of the people directly impacted, because they understand the experience most. They understand the pain, or they understand the nuances. They understand what's going on. 2, they know the context most intimately. They can see like, oh, there's flooding in this alley, and we're like, oh yeah, cars go through that. But that can be a big problem for people who are parking there. Or like if it's on this side and more people like to park on this side of the street, that could mean something else. Or, you know, like getting more of the context of the story of why this data matters. And then 3, really important for us at CNT, is compensating people for their time. I know that might be hard for, especially for media and journalists, but community members who, especially who are low income, really busy, are just like, are trying to make sure that they're supporting their families and communities. They don't have time to just go do things, volunteer all of the time. And so making sure to lower that barrier is super important if we want community science to be inclusive to all communities and the realities of the financial situations people have. So the next couple of slides are just examples of what people have taken and talking about when they went out to go after the storm and how it affects people. And I want you to like pick up, just kind of look at some of the pictures, but also how is it affecting people, right? Like these are the stories that we wouldn't necessarily get if it wasn't community members doing it, right? So like, for example, knowing that there's a church here and how it impacts who might be using the church. In Chicago, the West Nile is like West Nile virus from mosquitoes is a big concern, and that actually came up multiple times for certain populations who or certain folks who were taking pictures, and that's something I didn't think about when I think about flooding or like standing water. So we have talking about pedestrians, which more of us experience, but then for a lot of people who are driving, especially in the south suburbs, because there isn't a lot of transit, there might be potholes, which then impact their car, which has been a financial issue. But thinking about water in the alley and how that might relate to walking and driving, or like, what does that mean? And part of the reason we had most of the pictures focus on right-of-ways because they were communities, residents, and right, like for their own safety and for the residents' safety, like people wouldn't want to go to each other's homes. It was also during COVID, so that's kind of why we focus on the public right away. So I just want you to think about like what are, based on like some of the things here, if you want to type in the chat or just think about like anything you notice or are surprised by based on what has been shared on the couple of examples. But I'll keep moving along. And so now that we have this data, we just ended our like the last deployment at the end of May. And so we're going to be communicating this data. And so what do we do with it? Our goal again is to really inform the community. So to return power to them in this situation where they feel really isolated. They don't feel like municipalities are able to respond in the way they are. They can't control climate change. So what can they do with this data? And so there are 4 things that we're doing. One is we're making sure to integrate quantitative with qualitative. So we're going to have a map with all these numbers, but we're also going to have these pictures with these descriptions to really bring out what is happening, and also hopefully being able to talk to some folks and bring some of their stories from what's happening within their homes. 2 is how to analyze the data. People have different experiences with data. So making sure to support them on how to analyze it. And in analyzing it, thinking about how to analyze it in a way that tells a story and that tells a specific frame, because data in itself is never unbiased. All data is biased, all science is biased, because it's what's the methodology for collecting data? What's the way that people are going to use the data? And so like, you know, totally shoving that outside, like that concept of like the neutral scientist, like that has to be so, like, that's so important for media to really communicate, because that's why we hear all these like, oh, this person's right or this person's wrong. Like it's always about an angle. And so helping in the communication of data to talk about how do you analyze this to support moving towards community power is really important. Decoding jargon and uplifting nuance. Flooding is like, there's the personal experience, but the way that like policy people talk about it, it's like what's going on, right? And so making sure that residents can talk about the data that they see and understand what's going on is super important. And then 2, this kind of goes to Shannon's point about like when someone was asking about the whole like, do scientists like to talk about the process? Not necessarily so, because a lot of times people neglect the nuance of the process, or they neglect the like nuance of the methodology. And it's super important for us as we're communicating this data. It's like, hey, this data is going to say this, but it's also missing this piece. So how, as media folks, can you talk about like, it's also missing this piece, and it means that more needs to be added. Like this story isn't the final say of what the data is, what's happening with the data. And then 4 is, because we want to return power to communities, we're talking about how we want to kind of provide some examples of how they might use this in their like community meetings or working with organizing other residents so that they can use this data to continue moving forward. And so we'll be developing a tool, and one way that we're thinking about developing our tool, which is again another form of communication, is really thinking about who is our user and the audience, and then what are the learning goals? What do we want them to learn from it, and what do we want to learn from this process? And so these are some of the questions that we're thinking about as we develop the tools. How do we introduce folks to flooding data? Because that's very, especially the quantitative data is very different from the individual experience. Two is how to expand people's experience of flooding past their own individual experience. And then two, how can this data be helpful to rising community leaders in flood mitigation? Because our next phase is the leadership cohort. So how do we use this communication tool to further our work in supporting the leadership of communities? And so I just kind of want to leave this point, that data and communication should be used to return power to community members. So often, the powers that be, white, wealthy folks, are the ones who have taken away all of the power, and they've hoarded the power, and the same way they've hoarded the wealth, and that has led to climate change. Those systems that have led to climate change are only going to be undone. The only way to stop and change climate change is to redistribute that power. So how are we using data, communication, media to really return power to community members? And so I just want to thank you all for allowing me to present. And yeah, I'm going to hand it back to Sunshine now.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Really appreciate that. Questions? Go ahead, Tom.
Hey there. I just feel such a good sense of Chicago pride hearing of the work you're doing here. That's really great. That's really awesome. I wanted to ask, do you have any I don't know, success stories that you could share on how the data was used, and did it lead to any changes in any communities that you could share with us?
Yeah, so not specifically for this project because we're still in the middle of it, working towards it, but I know in the past, so CNT has done a lot of work around talking about urban flooding in Black and Brown communities. And because of that, that has led to like the state of Illinois first even acknowledging that urban flooding is a type of flooding to care about, right? And the data of that work moved that. And two, now there's a lot of work being done and a lot of like philanthropy work that's being done now, funding to support the green stormwater infrastructure in communities, especially that have been disinvested in. And so by helping show where a lot of the flooding claims have been, it shows that it's mostly in Black and Brown communities. So that has helped community organizations push and support more 311 calls from their communities, which now we see kind of a shift. What we were surprised when we saw the data, how some of the shift is with 311 data. So there are small wins here and there, some larger than others, but throughout the process there have been wins. It just definitely takes time because data itself doesn't cause the change. It has to be the people who are motivated to organize and push it.
Kate, go ahead.
Sure. I'm just curious, from the perspective, we had some really bad flooding in New York earlier this year, like in some of the subways after a lot of rain came through. And, from a visual perspective, one of the hard things is getting to remote places. So I'm curious if, figuring out exactly where you want to be. You can look at elevation, you can look at Twitter, but have you put any thought, because sharing the information of where this is happening or figuring out, at least with the journalistic community, and especially, I know during flooding, it's really hard because a lot of people are worried for safety, but I'm curious if in that aspect of communicating with journalists about, hey, it's not just Times Square or these very photographable places, but in terms of facilitating information that way. I know that's not exactly data, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's like, where is the data coming from, or where is it uplifting the information, right? In the same way that 311 calls, if not put a lot of effort, it only talks about a certain area. So before any of that though, it's really important to have trust building with the communities. A lot of Black and Brown communities, low-income communities, are highly surveilled. And so they don't want people just coming around taking pictures. So it's really important to make sure that there's a developing of community trust and relationships, especially with media. And that might not feel like it's a purview of y'all's work, but it is. Just the way as researchers, it's a purview of my work to make sure we have those relationships to be able to go out and do this. And then two, and part of that means, going to community events and hearing communities, because some of them are talking about it in different ways and creating that space to create that trust. That's what I would say first is really important. So it's not just about the iconic things, but also being real careful not to surveil them and make them feel more uncomfortable in the reality of what our world is.
Emily, go ahead.
You just sort of touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious about how much of a project like this or work like this comes from like an organization or a researcher like you saying like, I want to look at the problem of urban flooding in this city versus like a community that's like having a lot of problems with this, sort of reaching out and saying like, we want to do something, like we want to study this, we want to do a project like this, basically.
Can you say that the question part again?
Yeah, so I guess I'm wondering like, like how much comes from researchers, kind of coming in and saying like, we want to study this problem, let's do that studying by working with people in the community, and how much comes from people in the community saying, hey, we have our problem, like, what can we do about it?
Yeah.
And that leads to this kind of data collection project.
Yeah, so it's definitely a mix of both. One thing that's super important is that so many of these communities have already done so much work. And a lot of problems is with academia, nonprofits in the like nonprofit industrial complex, one philanthropy itself, media, right? Like we all think that we know better than the community itself. And that ain't true. It's not, because we are not there. We are trying to, like, it feels like we're just trying to grab and follow things when people are experiencing this. And so again, this goes back to really having trust with the communities that you are working with, to get to know who are the community leaders and talking to them, listening to them at their like public sessions, because sometimes they will host events and stuff like that. And that's super important. Because now that urban flooding is more of a thing, there are a lot of times when orgs are trying to get to know what urban flooding is happening, and they expect people just to fill out surveys, or they expect people to be willing to talk about it, but that's not going to happen. Like you all as media journalists know that you'll get no a lot of times, and that's true, especially from communities that don't have that trust. At the same time, it could be like, hey, we think that this is an issue because we've seen it elsewhere. And so it doesn't mean don't share those ideas, but find a way to do it respectfully, find a way where there is an opening, an opportunity to do that. Because if not, one, you're gonna look like you think you know way better than anyone else. Two, you're not gonna get that trust. And three, then we're all just contributing to the same problems that led to climate change in the first place, when we need to be returning power back.
Thank you, Catherine. That's a great segue for us to the final panelist. Maya, please go ahead.
Great. Yeah, I'm excited. And thank you both to the presenters before. I'm inspired, and we'll probably email you both to talk further. Great. So I'm going to share my slide. Can everyone see this? Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, so as Sunshine said, my name is Maya. I'm an engagement reporter at ProPublica. Excited to be with you all today. And as Ayurela said earlier, I'm just going to briefly talk about my bio, is that I worked at Wisconsin Health News for a couple of years, did climate reporting at Climate Central. I got a master's in science journalism as well. And then I've been at ProPublica now for about 3 years doing a lot of environmental health work. And so what does this engagement and crowdsource reporting mean at ProPublica? It's really about centering the journalism on the communities that we're working with to do this type of journalism. It's often things that a lot of journalists and you all have probably done in your day-to-day, but it's really building structures around it so that we can scale it up and just make this part of the fabric of our day-to-day journalism. And so at ProPublica, we have an engagement team, which is about 7 reporters now and an editor. It's treated similarly to the data team or the news apps team or research reporting team. And just to quickly show examples of the kind of work we do, a couple of years ago, my colleague Adriana Gallardo did a series about maternal mortality and disproportionate rates of maternal mortality among particularly Black women. And so we knew this universe of people that it was affecting. We did not have relationships with them. And so she probably spent, 6 to 8 months just developing those relationships, putting out a call out, but not taking for granted that people go to propublica.org who are trying to reach with this. So we republished with Cosmo. We also understood that it's something that's very sensitive to talk about for a lot of women. And so we gave people tools to interview their family members who have been through this and share those interviews with us. And we ultimately ended up identifying a couple hundred women who had, through their family members, et cetera, who have passed away in childbirth or almost passed away, to really understand what was leading to this higher rate of maternal mortality in the US. And throughout the project, we also published guides on advice that people were sharing on what they did in their own childbirth process, et cetera, things to look out for that would help them. Another example is working with the crowd to really crowdsource at scale. And so I think a good example of this is my colleague Ariana Tobin, who's now the editor of our team. They wanted to figure out kind of what the algorithms were in Facebook that they were using to target folks. And so they asked folks to install an extension in their Chrome or Safari browser that would scoop up their ads and then send them to our developers at ProPublica. And so they ended up getting 20,000 downloads through a lot of work themselves on, making sure people saw this, et cetera. And then through that, we're able to kind of discern what the algorithms were doing. And that led to a lot of focus and change on the advertisements, because they learned they were discriminatory in nature. And then a more recent example is I worked this last year on, and I saw actually on the first slide, I think it was the first presenter whose name is escaping me at the moment. But she showed a picture from the industrial hotspots across the country. And so our news apps developers had been working for 2 years to map all these toxic hotspots from industrial facilities that cause cancer. And we worked really hard to engage those communities who live around those facilities, understand what their experiences were. We sent postcards, and this is a picture of the postcards, to about 8,800 homes around the closest hotspots, with a link to the map and also a call out where they could share their experiences with us. And that led to a series of really fruitful work. I'm gonna skip by this quickly because we have limited time, but just this slide will be up on the resources page, I think. So you all should feel free to dive back in and read it more closely. And yeah, I wanted to just dive in quickly to a case study that I worked on last year about using this kind of framework as, treating community as experts as they are in the thing that you're investigating or reporting on, and really making sure they center this work. So this was the story that came about from this area of Florida in Palm Beach County. And so East Palm Beach County, you might know, is the home to Mar-a-Lago. West Palm Beach County is this area further west and further inland. And it's an area actually where the most of the country's cane sugar comes from in the US. And so there's about 400,000 acres. And in order to rid the cane of its outer leafy stalk to cultivate it, what they do is they burn it through it in this area of Florida. And that for decades, these three communities have been complaining that results in ash and smoke raining over their homes, that their children have asthma, that during burning season, they can't let their kids go outside, or then they end up in the hospital, et cetera. And actually they have restrictions. So when the smoke is projected to go east toward Mar-a-Lago area, they are not allowed to burn. This has been happening since about the 90s. And so this was part of our local reporting network, where a local reporter for Palm Beach Post, Lulu Ramadan, was incredible. She's now at the Seattle Times, wanted to do a really deep dive investigation into how this continues to exist today. And this kind of shows the smoke and how it goes over some of these areas. There's about 31,000 people who live here, predominantly people who are immigrants. Median income is about 30,000, and is something that they have been working on and dealing with for many, many years. And so what we knew from the beginning was this area of Palm Beach is actually not in the circulation area of Palm Beach Post. So the Palm Beach Post did not have any relationship with these communities who we wanted to work with for the next year. And so what we did first is what we do for a lot of engagement projects is really understanding the community. So we go to the American Community Survey, which is a great tool with information on languages that are spoken at home, Wi-Fi access, etc. It just helps you really kind of understand the different characteristics of the neighborhoods or cities that you're working with or towns. And then identifying community leaders. So we recognized that a lot of people were immigrants and particularly from Haiti. So we went to some Creole speaking pastors who run churches and asked them, we're not from this community, we're outsiders. We really want to do this work alongside with the community to identify the problem and base the journalism around that. Can you help us? Can you give us some advice? And just treating these people and interviewing them about community dynamics, etc. And these are some of the questions we often ask ourselves that I included below that you can revisit as well. And so what we learned with this area is that the Wi-Fi access was particularly low. And so we decided that what we would start with is just to do a deep listening campaign. Is we knew that there had been a couple pretty bad burns where sent school children to hospitals back a decade or so ago. And so we were like, let's reach out to teachers. And the Palm Beach Post in Florida, the records laws are really great. And so the Palm Beach Post had a list of all the teachers going back decades, their email addresses and their phone numbers. And so what we did is we hand addressed letters to about 159 teachers and school staff, custodians as well, saying, hey, this is who we are. We haven't covered this before, but here's what we covered. We sent pictures of our bios, et cetera, and explained what we were trying to do in looking into this problem, or, what we thought was our hypothesis was that it was a problem and that we wanted to hear back. And so we heard back from people through text message when they got the letters. And then we also spent time doing follow-up phone calls and texts with them. We kept everything in a spreadsheet, and this was really important because actually we ended up getting scooped with this initial school story that we wanted to tell. And so we went back after these 2 months of just deep community listening to these notes that we kept. And we found that a common question that came up was, how is it possible that, we're experiencing these ashy days where we feel like we can't bring our children outside, or teachers told us about how over the loudspeaker on days where they were when there was burning, they would say, don't take out the students for recess, let's do everything indoors, etc. But that the sugar companies are saying the air is totally safe. And so we decided to ask then folks, we had this initial idea, maybe we could do some air monitoring with residents. And so we asked them if they were interested in this effort. And so we went back to them, asked them, they were like, yes, we'll host sensors, we'll do what we can. We really want to get to the bottom of what's in the air. These are bad pictures of me and Lulu FaceTiming some of the residents who we worked with when our sensors that we ended up installing would spike with signaling that there's pollution, so we could see what things were like. And then we also set up an informal advisory board. And this included people who knew about air quality, so people at the EPA or who had been at the EPA, as well as some academics, but also really importantly, it included the residents themselves, and they helped us draft outreach language. They helped us identify kind of how to do this and how to actually connect and include the community in this work. And we ended up choosing Purple Air, which is also a really good tool. It's all open access. And if you visit Purple Air's website, you can check out a map, and this is what it looks like. They also have an API that you can scrape. So it's really good in terms of that kind of work. And then here's a picture you can revisit later, but just as we put up these sensors, we emailed our experts and wanted to make sure they were in the right place. And then simultaneously, there were some data challenges with this work because the burning, essentially the companies say, hey, we're gonna burn, we wanna maybe burn these 40 or hundreds of little plots of land today. But they end up at the end of the day maybe canceling some they didn't burn. So we knew that we couldn't be at all of those places at once. And so we asked for the community's help to figure out if burning was actually taking place when our sensors were sensing a spike in pollution. And so we set up a text bot through a free tool called Dialogflow that anyone can use. And when we saw that there was plumes of smoke that was overlapping with our sensors and there was a spike, we sent it out to residents they helped us develop these questions, as did some social researchers, and said, do you see or smell smoke? Can you send us pictures, etc. And so that was a case study in kind of engaged journalism, how we work with communities to crowdsource, et cetera. And some of the tools I'll also focus on or bring back up at the end of the call, or sorry, at the end of the presentation. These are some metrics that we think about for success for each story. Again, you guys should feel free to revisit this afterwards. And then, yeah, just I mentioned some tools while I was talking, and I just put them together on this last slide. I also added a couple of more. I think there's a lot of opportunities for citizen science work in journalism. It can take time, but it also doesn't have to be as long as the process that it took us for our story. Yeah, a couple of these things, like the USPS, the way we sent postcards was through this everyday direct mail program. And then there's some cool community-driven databases that I love, which are IC Change, which tracks flooding in neighborhoods and other events like that. And then Smell My City, which is like people who live in industrial areas, and if they're smelling something that day, report it, and that database is able to download. And I also just want to speak to the importance of, the impact of the work that this generally has when you have this type of community buy-in. It's really difficult for leaders to ignore. And we were also really sure to close the feedback loop to ensure that residents had information. So after we published, we ended up putting up together a flyer with like bullet points of our story, and we circulated that in food banks and to all of the places that we had initially visited. We also sent letters back to those 159 teachers, and actually one of the academics who was on our informal advisory panel got a $218,000 grant from NASA to do our work at a bigger scale. And so this upcoming burn season, her and her team are going to be installing 42 monitors in the area of the Glades, and we did 6. And there was also calls for investigations. And then, on the journalism side of thing, the story and project was recognized as a Pulitzer finalist, and the Palm Beach Post, which has been undergoing a lot of layoffs and cuts recent years, are trying to figure out kind of how to do more of this work and make more space for it. So I think it's definitely something that can be time consuming, but there's also ways to bake it into your reporting in shorter ways. So I think I'm a little over time, so I will stop now.
Thanks, Maya. All right, questions, comments? I will note that Max just put in the chat that you wanted to comment generally that this was remarkable work, Maya, and wondering what US Sugar's response was once the story was published.
Yeah, they are pretty aggressive. We knew that from the outset, and that's actually why we took care to really try to do this work with residents. And we talked to obviously people with the Sierra Club and all the stakeholders, but we knew that if we featured them, we would be attacked by the sugar companies. And so to get people to sign up for the text pop, we called like every 6th person on the voter rolls. We did a phone bank one night where we just like asked all of our colleagues, or as many as they wanted, to join us and call them to see if they would sign up, and just really like randomly sampled people. And then we also shared all of our data that we collected through the purple air monitors with the sugar companies, and they did their own analysis on them. And then alongside with the story, we published the kind of back and forth that we had with the sugar companies, and said like they're calling us out for saying we're wrong in our work, but here's our response. We haven't issued any corrections for the stories, but they, people associated with them have taken out some attack articles against us, and specifically my colleague Lulu. And so, yeah, it's something that was difficult for sure throughout the process. And I don't think I've ever worked on a project where a company was so aggressive, but it's something that we really kept in mind and that informed our approach from the beginning.
Sarah, go ahead. Still muted, yeah.
Got it. Yeah, I wanted to second. I mean, it's just kind of an amazing project. It's so thorough. I wanted to ask about something you said, though, Maya, about how there may be some shortcuts to doing this, just because, I mean, this looks amazing for a small staff. I don't know who doesn't have like a development or developer team or anything like that. It also just seems impossible. Like, are there any strategies kind of that you would recommend for this kind of work that that can be done at a smaller scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think just like going back to Kate's example when she was talking about like how to identify people who are in more flooding prone areas that aren't Times Square, et cetera. I think like for example, finding 311 or 911 calls from that day and seeing where they were made the most, and then spending time maybe distributing flyers in libraries, just saying like, we understand this area had a high volume of calls. We're setting up a text bot, so for the next flooding event, you know, this area gets attention, or we know what's going on here. Like, and then sign up here through putting your number here, or sign up, and then you can go back the next week and collect the flyers or do workshops in these neighborhoods. And then dialogue flow is totally free, and I'm not a coder at all, like don't know the first thing about it. And I was able to set up the text bot. It's a Google tool. So there's ways of doing that. You know, just thinking about how to build relationships over time and build time into your day to just go to community spaces that your outlet might want to cover better or do more coverage with. And just making room for like listening sessions is a great place to start.
Was that called Dialogue Bot? Is that what you just said?
Dialogue flow. Yeah.
Oh, Dialogue Flow. Thank you.
Dialogue flow. Yeah. And cost actually. So the purple airs are about $200, $250 each. And we paid for three of them, and the Palm Beach Post paid for three of them. And we now have them in our newsrooms as tools. And so it's things we're thinking about deploying in the future for future projects. And so if you ever think about, you know, opportunities to do testing with residents, I think that there's some increasingly technology is allowing us to do things, you know, for cheaper than $250 a lot of times. Like we just did some indoor radon testing with residents, and the kits were $35 for 2 or 3 of them. And so I think there's ways to try to like pitch smaller bites of this to the newsroom and using it going forward.
I don't know if I missed this, but can you tell us, was it just the two of you working on this, and how long did you work on this project from like idea to finished project?
Yeah, so Lulu pitched this to us in February 2020, and then obviously the world imploded and COVID descended upon us, and so we accepted her as a fellow for the local reporting network, which if anyone is interested to, ProPublica opens up cycles for local reporting networks. And it's, if you have an idea that you want to do that you think will roughly take a year, and you want some investigative support, they'll pay the salary of the reporter, and then provide, you know, staff support like myself and editing as well. And so just wanted to throw that out there. But so yeah, Lulu pitched it to us. She was going to start in March, April, but then we delayed that until about July. And then we spent about 2 or 3 months just doing this letter writing, conversations, deep listening until we got scooped. And then we pivoted, and the first story published in July. So I think since it took about a year of work, and it was me, Lulu, and my colleague Ash, who's a news apps developer, and they are the ones who did the data analysis for after we installed all of the purple airs, etc. And we also had a ton of editors and a lot of, you know, staff, like photographer from the Palm Beach Post, etc.
So we have like 7 minutes left or something. So please feel free to address questions to any of the panelists at this point.
I'm just curious, actually, a quick follow-up, Maya. If this was a year-long project, you're not based in Florida, are you? Was Lulu kind of on the ground, the point person? Were you doing a lot of reporting trips, or how did you navigate working on the building community trust and doing this on the ground reporting, but also not living in Palm Beach for the entire year?
Yeah, no, I'm based in New York City, and Lulu is she's now at the Seattle Times. She was based in Palm Beach. So yeah, she's the one who was on the ground installing the sensors, etc. But honestly, it was during the beginning and height of COVID, during which everyone was doing things virtually and remote as much as possible. And so there were like church sessions we Zoomed into together. And even though Lulu was there, the whole church session was over Zoom. And we found that actually like you can do a lot of this work remotely, like letter writing, following up with phone calls, etc. Like Lulu did do rounds of door knocking when it was a little bit safer to do that, but just given the risks, I probably would have, if it wasn't COVID, spent more time on the ground there. But yeah, because Lulu is, the nice thing about this local reporting network is the local reporters are the experts in doing this type of coverage, their community much better than like I do, or other staff that lives in New York City. And so we really work closely together, and it helps us not do the parachuting kind of work, and especially when you build in those months of just listening and in the beginning of a project to help shape it.
Sure, thanks.
I'm curious to hear from all of the panelists about the potential for journalism organizations to work with strictly community-based groups, maybe on a project that would start sort of from the ground up in a community where you're gathering data, knowing that it's part of a journalistic project. Some of the projects we've heard about haven't been intended for a media outlet, but I wonder if you see potential for that kind of arrangement.
Can start. I think generally it depends on what the goals and the priorities of the community is. And I would say that because it may be that that it is like to get the attention of like a local environmental department, and thus like engaging with a journalist who's going to write a fantastic story, but one that may, counter relationship building between local government and a community. It could be problematic. But I think that it's, I said this is somebody else's question, media and journalism is such an important tool of organizing. And I think that like we always have to consider that it's, before the science tools come in, before the technology tools come in, this is about communities coming together around, something that is harming the people in their neighborhoods, harming their environment. And so I think certainly, it is a well-used tool when it can be, and when there's journalists that are interested in taking up these stories.
Yeah, definitely want to echo what Shannon said. It's definitely based on the goals of the community, and right, like the whole inside outside game, like community-based organizations have to do that all the time because they can move so much stuff inside, but then it requires outside, right? So having that media like piece is really helpful. And I'd say also like, right, like there are other, like thinking about media as an organizing tool, like how can like journalistic media also relate to social media work that helps them do a lot of organizing, right? So like what are the other types of media that can be tied somehow, because that is another way that people get news. Like getting more creative in those ways can help create, like, what is that like whole lifespan of media that could be potentially helpful throughout the different points of a campaign.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add on that front. I feel like, yeah, they probably know better. Yeah.
Your project seems like it was designed by journalists and not like a cooperative plan that was developed with a community group, right, Maya?
Yeah, it was developed with like community members and like some experts as well, but not like I think it's more difficult sometimes to do formal partnerships with community-based organizations, especially if they sometimes do advocacy or activism work. I think our bosses are sometimes wary of doing partnerships like that.
Do you, apropos of the comment Catherine just put in the chat about having a paid advisory group being really helpful, Maya, was your advisory group paid?
No, unpaid. We were really grateful. Again, I think we have limitations as to like who we can pay, especially if some people we quote in stories or sources. So I know our data team has a advisory board generally that they do have like a retainer for every year where they bring larger questions to them, and it is more so about shaping how they do the data work and building like checks and balances, etc. But yeah, for us in the past, we've mostly done informal advisory groups, and we're very upfront with the folks at the beginning, kind of just like the type of commitment we're asking for, the time length, and what they can expect. And if they don't want to do it, we completely understand.
I'll add that like another maybe angle on this issue of, I totally understand that often, if not almost always, journalists are going to have a really hard time paying sources. Okay, understood. I just want to note that there are more and more, like it's called community-based participatory research. There's lots of names, but community-based participatory research is a very academic name for ways that a lot of academics are, to greater and lesser degrees, and sometimes truly in greater degrees, co-creating research projects with communities. And in those cases, the research, the professional researchers, the academics may have grant funding that is supporting community participation in the overall research, at which point that could be like a way around that problem for the reporters. If you're partnering with another group that's doing this work, they're taking care of the pay and you're collaborating on the story. I don't know if that like cuts the mustard or not for the reporters, but it's just something that occurred to me. All right, any final comments from anyone or questions? Okay, thank you so much to Shannon and Catherine and Maya. It was really a great session. Very much appreciate your time.